The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the small military outpost near the Morrison Ranch, turning the dusty ground into waves of shimmering heat. Kate Morrison had ridden into the settlement for supplies, a routine trip she'd made countless times in her 22 years. But today was different. Today, a crowd had gathered near the fort's entrance, their voices carrying a mixture of satisfaction and morbid curiosity that made Kate's stomach tighten with unease. She guided her horse closer, trying to see what had drawn such attention, and felt her breath catch when the scene came into view. A young man, clearly Apache based on his traditional clothing and long dark hair, was chained to a wooden post in the blazing sun. His head hung forward, consciousness clearly fading, his lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration. The chains were tight enough to prevent him from sitting or finding any relief from the relentless heat. Around him, members of the civilian militia that had captured him stood guard, their weapons prominently displayed, while onlookers pointed and made comments that Kate couldn't quite hear but could imagine from their expressions. This wasn't justice or defense, it was cruelty disguised as necessity. Kate dismounted and approached the fort commander, Captain Williams, whom she'd known since childhood. Her voice was steady despite the anger building inside her as she asked what the prisoner had done to deserve such treatment. Williams explained with bureaucratic detachment that the Apache had been caught defending an illegal camp near disputed water sources, had resisted arrest, and was being held as an example to discourage further territorial violations. The water sources in question, Kate knew, had been used by Apache bands for generations before settlers arrived, a detail the captain conveniently omitted. She asked about basic humane treatment, water at minimum, but Williams dismissed her concerns with patronizing assurance that the savage would be transferred to proper authorities soon enough. The term savage hung in the air, a word Kate had heard all her life applied to Apache people, yet looking at the young man slowly dying in chains, all she saw was suffering that transcended categories of civilization or savagery. She returned to her horse, collected her supplies with mechanical efficiency, but her mind was elsewhere, caught between the practical understanding that intervening could bring serious consequences and the moral certainty that walking away would haunt her forever. The ride back to the Morrison Ranch felt longer than usual, Kate's thoughts circling endlessly around the chained warrior. She'd been raised to respect authority, to understand the complexities of frontier life, to recognize that survival sometimes required hard choices. Her father, Thomas Morrison, had built their ranch through determination and careful navigation of territorial politics. He'd always taught her that getting involved in conflicts between military and Apache was dangerous for everyone, that their family's security depended on maintaining good relations with both civilian authorities and military command. But Kate had also been educated beyond what was typical for ranchers' daughters. Her mother, before passing away 5 years ago, had insisted on hiring tutors, on Kate reading philosophy and literature, on developing her mind as thoroughly as her practical ranch skills. That education had given Kate frameworks for thinking about justice, about the social contract, about when laws deserved respect and when they demanded resistance. The image of the dying warrior tested every principle she'd studied, every belief about human dignity she'd developed. Dinner that evening at the Morrison Ranch was tense. Kate's father noticed her distraction immediately, and when pressed, she described what she'd witnessed. Thomas's reaction was exactly what she'd expected, concern mixed with firm insistence that she stay out of it. The Apache situation was complicated, he explained. Water rights were legitimately disputed, and the military had procedures for handling prisoners. Getting involved would only make things worse for everyone, including the prisoner himself, if Kate's interference angered the militia. Her younger brother, James, agreed enthusiastically, repeating common sentiments about Apache raiders and the need for strong responses. Kate retired to her room early, claiming fatigue, but sleep was impossible. Through her window, she could see the half-moon rising over the prairie, casting silver light across the landscape. She thought about the warrior, whether he was still conscious, whether anyone had shown him basic mercy, whether he had family wondering what had happened to him. The reasonable arguments for staying uninvolved played through her mind alongside the simple, devastating reality that a human being was suffering and dying while people with the power to help chose not to. Sometimes she realized the right choice and the safe choice weren't the same, and she had to decide which kind of person she wanted to be. Kate waited until well past midnight, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into sleep. Her father and brother had retired hours ago, and the ranch hands were in their bunkhouse at the far end of the property. She dressed in dark, practical clothes, filled 2 canteens with water, and gathered some bread and dried meat that wouldn't be immediately missed. Her hands trembled slightly as she saddled her horse in the barn, the enormity of what she was considering finally becoming real. This wasn't just breaking rules. It was potentially destroying her family's standing in the community and putting herself in genuine danger. The ride to the outpost took nearly an hour, Kate keeping to less traveled paths and moving cautiously to avoid being seen. The settlement was mostly dark when she arrived, just a few lanterns burning at guard posts. She'd counted on the militia being less vigilant at night, and her knowledge of the area's layout helped her approach from an angle with minimal visibility. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain it would give her away, but she forced herself to move steadily, projecting confidence she didn't feel. The warrior was exactly where she'd last seen him, still chained to the post, his head hanging at an angle that suggested unconsciousness rather than sleep. Kate approached cautiously, listening for any sound of guards or patrols. When she was close enough, she whispered softly, unsure if he could even hear her. His head lifted slightly, dark eyes opening to focus on her with obvious confusion. Kate held up the canteen, miming drinking, and saw understanding flicker across his face. She held the canteen to his cracked lips, letting him drink slowly, aware that too much water too quickly could be harmful. The warrior drank gratefully, and Kate saw awareness returning to his eyes as hydration began reviving him. She offered food, which he ate with careful deliberation despite obvious hunger. Throughout this, they maintained silence except for Kate's whispered assurances that she wasn't there to harm him. She noticed details in the moonlight that hadn't been visible earlier. He was younger than she'd thought, probably close to her own age, and beneath the dirt and exhaustion, his face held a strength and intelligence that contradicted every stereotype she'd been taught about Apache warriors. And suddenly Kate knew that bringing water wasn't enough, that leaving him chained to die slowly was unacceptable, that she had to take the next impossible step and free him completely. Finding the key to the chains became Kate's immediate challenge. She knew it would likely be kept either at the guard post or with Captain Williams himself. Breaking the chains without a key was impossible with the tools she'd brought. For a moment, she considered returning another night with better equipment, but looking at the warrior's condition, she doubted he'd survive another day in the scorching sun. The decision crystallized. If she was going to act, it had to be now, which meant taking even greater risks than she'd already accepted. The guard post was a small wooden structure near the fort's entrance, and Kate could see through the window that only one guard was present, dozing at his desk. A ring of keys hung on the wall behind him, clearly visible and tantalizingly close. Kate circled the building, looking for options, and found a back window that was partially open for ventilation. It was small, but she was slender enough to fit through if she was careful. The alternative was trying to talk her way past the guard, claiming some emergency, but that would mean being seen and identified. Kate made her choice and squeezed through the window with agonizing slowness, every small sound seeming impossibly loud in the quiet night. The guard snored softly, and she moved with excruciating care across the room, her eyes fixed on the keyring. Her fingers closed around it, and she lifted it from the hook with held breath, praying the keys wouldn't jingle against each other. Backing toward the window, she felt her boot catch on something, a corner of the desk, and she stumbled slightly. The guard stirred, and Kate froze completely, her heart threatening to burst from her chest. Long seconds passed before the guard's breathing settled back into the rhythm of sleep. Kate resumed her careful retreat, climbing back through the window and dropping to the ground outside with legs that felt like water. She clutched the keys tightly and hurried back to where the warrior waited, hoping desperately that one of these keys would fit his chains. When she reached him, his eyes showed surprise that she'd returned, then widening shock when he saw the keys. Kate tried several before finding the right one, and the chains fell away with a metallic sound that seemed deafening in the night silence. The warrior tried to stand but collapsed, his legs unable to support him after hours of restricted circulation. Kate caught him as best she could, and together they stumbled into the darkness, leaving behind the chains and the relative safety of Kate's uncomplicated life. Getting the warrior back to the Morrison Ranch required every bit of Kate's knowledge of the terrain and her physical strength. He tried to walk independently, pride evident despite his weakness, but his body repeatedly betrayed him. Finally, Kate convinced him to lean on her, and they made painfully slow progress toward her property. She avoided the main ranch buildings, instead heading toward an old line shack on the far edge of Morrison land, a small cabin used during cattle drives but currently empty and forgotten by most of the ranch hands. Dawn was approaching by the time they reached the shack, pale light beginning to color the eastern sky. Kate got the warrior inside and settled onto the simple cot, then fetched water from a nearby creek and returned to find him already unconscious again, his body demanding rest after the ordeal. She studied him in the growing light, noting the rope burns on his wrists from the chains, the sunburn covering exposed skin, the dehydration evident in his features. She left more water and food within reach, along with a blanket despite the Texas heat, knowing that shock and trauma could cause chills. The ride back to the main ranch house required Kate to compose herself, to prepare plausible explanations for her absence and disheveled appearance. She arrived just as her father and brother were beginning morning routines, and claimed she'd been unable to sleep and had gone for an early ride. Thomas accepted this with only mild concern, accustomed to his daughter's occasional restlessness. Kate forced herself through breakfast and normal conversation, every moment aware of the enormous secret she was now carrying and the consequences that would follow if it was discovered. Throughout the day, Kate managed her regular responsibilities, while her mind remained fixed on the line shack. She needed to check on the warrior, to bring more supplies to figure out what happened next. But visiting too soon or too often would raise questions. She waited until late afternoon, claiming she needed to check fence lines on the far pasture, and finally returned to the shack. The warrior was awake, sitting up, and his hand moved instinctively toward where a weapon would be before he recognized her. Kate raised her hands in a peaceful gesture, and some of the tension left his posture. She offered more food and water, which he accepted with a slight nod that might have been gratitude, and then they faced the challenge of communication across a vast language and cultural divide. Over the next several days, Kate established a careful routine of visiting the line shack under various pretexts, bringing food, water, and basic medical supplies she'd carefully gathered without arousing suspicion. The warrior, whom she learned was called Nako, through patient gestures and repeated attempts at pronunciation, recovered his strength gradually. His mistrust of her motivations remained evident. Years of conflict between their peoples not easily overcome by one act of mercy, but necessity forced a degree of cooperation. Communication developed slowly through a mixture of hand gestures, drawings in the dirt, and the few words they managed to teach each other. Kate learned that Nako was 24, that his band had been camping near the disputed water source because it was traditionally their territory, and that he'd been defending his younger sister when the militia captured him. His concern for his family's safety was palpable, and Kate understood that his gratitude for rescue was complicated by guilt about leaving them unprotected and worry about what might have happened in his absence. Kate found herself fascinated by glimpses into Apache culture that emerged through their halting conversations. Nako described his people's connection to the land, their understanding of survival in harsh terrain, their complex social structures that bore little resemblance to the savage raiders of settler stories. He was surprised by Kate's education and independence, his experience with white women limited to those he'd seen from distance or those who'd treated his people with fear and hostility. Gradually, mutual curiosity began replacing pure suspicion. The fourth night of Nako's recovery, Kate arrived at the line shack to find him standing and moving with increasing steadiness. He'd clearly been exercising, testing his body's readiness for travel. Through gestures and the words they'd established, he communicated that he needed to leave soon, to return to his people, and he wanted Kate to understand his gratitude despite the language barrier. Kate felt an unexpected pang at the thought of him leaving, this person who'd become more than just a rescued prisoner, who'd challenged assumptions she'd held all her life. But she also knew he couldn't stay hidden indefinitely. That discovery was only a matter of time, and that his best chance for survival lay in returning to his band as soon as he was strong enough for the journey. Kate's carefully maintained secret unraveled on the 8th day of Nako's recovery. She'd been returning from the line shack when she encountered her brother James riding toward the same area, checking cattle that had wandered toward the property's edge. James's suspicion was immediately aroused by Kate's defensive explanation of her presence, and when he insisted on accompanying her back to the main house, she knew he'd spotted something amiss. The next morning, James rode out early toward the line shack, and Kate's stomach dropped with certainty about what he'd find. James burst into the ranch house 2 hours later, his face flushed with anger and shock, demanding their father join him immediately for something he needed to see. Kate's heart raced as she watched them ride off together, knowing her actions were about to face judgment. She considered riding to warn Nako, to help him escape before they arrived, but she knew running would only make things worse. Instead, she prepared herself for the confrontation she'd known was inevitable from the moment she'd chosen to cut those chains. When Thomas and James returned with Nako between them, the warrior's hands bound with rope, Kate felt her world splitting into before and after this moment. Her father's face showed disappointment and anger in equal measure, while James looked vindicated and eager to involve the militia. Nako's expression was carefully neutral, but his eyes sought Kate's with a question she couldn't answer. What would happen now? Thomas sent James to his room with firm orders to speak to no one until they'd decided how to handle the situation, then turned to Kate with devastating quiet. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of Kate's life. She explained her actions, her motivations, the impossibility of watching another person die when she had the power to prevent it. Thomas listened without interruption, then outlined the consequences they now faced. Harboring an escaped prisoner could cost them their ranch, their standing in the community, potentially their freedom. The militia would be searching for Nako, and when they discovered the Morrisons had hidden him, the repercussions would be severe. James would want to contact authorities immediately, claiming civic duty, and Thomas wasn't certain he could argue against that position without putting his entire family at risk. The ranch house became a pressure cooker of conflicting loyalties and impossible decisions over the next hours. James argued vehemently for immediately turning Nako over to authorities, claiming it was their duty and the only way to protect the family from accusations of harboring criminals. Kate defended her actions with equal passion, insisting that returning Nako to the militia meant condemning him to certain mistreatment or worse, that some things mattered more than safety or reputation. Thomas sat between them, torn between protecting his family and the growing realization that his daughter might be right about the fundamental injustice of the situation. Nako remained silent throughout most of this debate, understanding enough of the tension, if not all the words, to recognize that his fate was being decided. Kate occasionally translated key points, wanting him to understand what was being discussed and argued. His dignity under these circumstances impressed even James, who'd expected aggressive resistance or attempts to escape. When Thomas finally asked Kate to translate a direct question for Nako, asking what the warrior would do if released, Nako's response was simple: return to his family, leave this area entirely, and cause no trouble for the Morrisons who'd shown him unexpected mercy. The decision point came when Thomas asked Kate a question that cut to the heart of everything. Could she live with herself if they turned Nako over, knowing what would likely happen to him? Kate's answer was immediate and certain. No, she couldn't, and she'd rather face whatever consequences came from helping him than live with the guilt of betraying the principles she'd been taught to value. Thomas looked at his daughter for a long moment, seeing perhaps for the first time the woman she'd become rather than the child she'd been, and made his choice. They would help Nako return to his people, but secretly, in a way that gave the Morrison family plausible deniability. James exploded at this decision, accusing his father of choosing an Apache warrior over his own family's safety, of letting Kate's emotions override practical reality. Thomas responded with surprising steel, pointing out that sometimes doing the right thing required accepting risk, and that he'd rather face consequences for showing mercy than live comfortably knowing they'd participated in cruelty. He ordered James to say nothing about Nako's presence, threatening consequences if his son's actions endangered Kate or the warrior. James stormed from the room, his face showing betrayal and anger, leaving the others to plan how to accomplish what they'd committed to doing. Planning Nako's safe return to his people required careful consideration of terrain, timing, and the militia patrols that would be searching for him. Thomas's knowledge of the territory proved invaluable, and he identified a route that would minimize exposure while leading toward areas where Apache bands were known to camp. Nako contributed his own knowledge through translated discussions with Kate, describing landmarks and safe passages that settlers wouldn't typically know. Despite the tension of their situation, working together on the logistics created a strange sense of common purpose. Kate insisted on being part of the journey, arguing that Nako trusted her and that her presence would ensure he reached safety. Thomas initially refused, unwilling to risk his daughter further, but Kate's determination eventually wore down his resistance. They compromised. Kate would accompany Nako for the first part of the journey, along with Thomas and 2 ranch hands who'd proven trustworthy, then return while the others continued to ensure the warrior reached Apache territory. The plan would require 2 days of travel, and they'd need to leave soon before militia searches intensified. Preparations took most of a day, gathering supplies in ways that wouldn't attract attention, preparing horses, and creating cover stories for their absence. James remained stubbornly isolated, refusing to participate but also, critically, not actively interfering. Kate sensed her brother's internal struggle between family loyalty and his belief that they were making a terrible mistake. She tried once more to explain her perspective, to help him understand that the humanity they shared with Nako was more important than the conflicts between their peoples. But James couldn't or wouldn't hear it. The night before their planned departure, Kate visited Nako in the small storage room where they'd moved him for better concealment. Through their now familiar mixture of words and gestures, she tried to explain what would happen the next day, and why her family was taking these risks. Nako's response surprised her with its emotional depth, despite the language barrier. He spoke at length in Apache, and though Kate understood only fragments, the tone conveyed gratitude, respect, and something that transcended the specific situation, an acknowledgement that her actions had challenged his own assumptions about all settlers being enemies, just as knowing him had challenged hers about Apache warriors. Understanding could grow even in the hardest soil, given chance and courage. They departed before dawn, a small group moving quietly through the pre-dawn darkness. Thomas led the way with Kate and Nako riding side by side, and 2 trusted ranch hands, Miguel and Sam, bringing up the rear. Everyone was armed, not for offense but for the very real possibility of encountering danger from multiple directions. Militia patrols who would recognize Nako, hostile settlers who might shoot first and ask questions later, or even Apache scouts who might not recognize Nako's companions as friendly until too late. The first day passed in tense silence, everyone hyper-aware of their surroundings and the gravity of what they were doing. Kate noticed how Nako's posture changed as they moved farther from settled areas, some of the wariness leaving his shoulders as the landscape became more familiar to him. He occasionally pointed out features, a distinctive rock formation, a hidden water source, signs of animal passage, sharing knowledge that spoke to deep connection with this land. Thomas observed these interactions with visible thoughtfulness, perhaps beginning to understand what Kate had been trying to explain about the Apache people's relationship to the territory. As evening approached, they made camp in a sheltered canyon that Nako had indicated through gestures, a place where fire could be safely hidden and approaches could be watched. Over a simple meal, with Kate translating as best she could, Nako told Thomas about his family, his younger sister who depended on him, his mother who'd lost 2 other children to conflict and disease, his responsibility as a warrior to protect his band. Thomas shared his own story of building the ranch, of losing Kate's mother, of trying to raise his children to be strong and principled in a world that often rewarded neither quality. Despite everything separating them, the 2 men found common ground in their love for family and desire to protect those depending on them. That night, Kate lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the canyon, thinking about how much had changed in less than 2 weeks. She'd broken laws, defied authority, risked her family's security, and discovered that the world was far more complex than the simple narratives she'd grown up with. Looking at Nako sleeping nearby, she realized she'd also discovered something about her own capacity for courage and the importance of acting on conviction even when it was difficult. Whatever happened next, she'd never be the same person who'd ridden into that settlement and seen a chained warrior, never be able to accept injustice with the comfortable distance she'd once maintained. The second day brought them to the edge of territory where Apache bands were known to range, an area settlers avoided, and military patrols entered cautiously. Nako's alertness increased, scanning the landscape for signs Kate and the others couldn't read. Around midday, he suddenly became animated, pointing toward distant figures that Kate could barely distinguish from the terrain. Through gestures and their shared vocabulary, Nako communicated that he recognized his people, that he could proceed safely from here, and that the Morrisons should turn back before being seen by Apache scouts who might not understand their peaceful intentions. The moment of parting came with unexpected emotion. Nako spoke to Thomas first, a formal statement that Kate translated haltingly, thanking him for his family's courage and mercy, acknowledging the risk they'd taken, and promising that his band would remember this kindness. Thomas responded with equal formality, expressing hope that Nako's people would find peace, and that perhaps someday the conflicts between settlers and Apache could be resolved through understanding rather than violence. The words felt inadequate for the significance of what had passed between them, but both men seemed to recognize the genuine intention behind the language barrier. When Nako turned to Kate, the communication became more personal, despite the watching eyes of her father and the ranch hands. He spoke quietly in Apache, then tried in halting English to express what her actions had meant. Not just the rescue, but the respect she'd shown, the willingness to see him as a person rather than an enemy, the courage to act on conscience despite consequences. Kate found herself unexpectedly emotional, realizing how much his survival had come to matter to her, how this brief, intense connection had changed her understanding of the world. She gave him supplies for his journey more than he needed, a final gesture of care. Nako removed a small woven bracelet from his wrist, one of the few possessions he still carried, and offered it to Kate. Through Miguel, who knew some Apache, he explained it had been made by his mother and carried protection prayers. Giving it to Kate was his way of honoring what she'd risked for him and ensuring she remained under his family's spiritual protection. Kate accepted it with trembling hands, understanding the significance of such a gift. Then Nako stepped back, raised his hand in farewell and turned toward his distant people. Kate watched him walk away until he disappeared into the landscape, feeling both loss and strange peace. She'd done what she knew was right, regardless of cost, and that conviction would sustain her through whatever came next. The ride back to the Morrison Ranch took 2 days, giving Kate time to reflect on everything that had happened and prepare for the reactions that would surely come once word spread about Nako's disappearance from the line shack. But the response, when it came, surprised everyone. The militia, embarrassed by the escape and unwilling to admit that a woman had outwitted their security, reported simply that the prisoner had somehow freed himself and fled. Captain Williams conducted a perfunctory investigation, but found no concrete evidence linking the Morrisons to the escape, just James's angry but ultimately unsubstantiated suspicions. Thomas addressed the situation by saying nothing, neither confirming nor denying any involvement, and his reputation in the community was strong enough that most people accepted his word, that the ranch had nothing to do with military matters. James remained bitter about his father's choices, but as weeks passed with no consequences materializing, his anger gradually cooled into reluctant acceptance that perhaps the risk had been worth taking. The divide between the siblings would take longer to heal, but Kate hoped that time would help James understand the principles that had guided her actions. Life at the Morrison Ranch slowly returned to its regular rhythms, but Kate felt the change in herself permanently. She wore Nako's bracelet hidden under her sleeve, a private reminder of what she'd learned about courage, justice, and seeing beyond the boundaries society constructed. She found herself questioning other assumptions she'd previously accepted without examination, looking more critically at territorial policies and the treatment of indigenous peoples, speaking up more frequently when conversations turned to dismissing Apache humanity. 3 months after Nako's departure, a small bundle appeared on the Morrison porch one morning, discovered by Kate before anyone else was awake. Inside was beautiful beadwork, clearly Apache craftsmanship, along with a roughly drawn image showing a warrior and a woman, both raising their hands in farewell. No words accompanied the gift, but none were needed. Nako had survived, had returned to his family, and was letting Kate know that her actions were remembered. The gift also carried an unspoken message, that understanding between peoples was possible when individuals chose courage over comfort, compassion over convention. Kate placed the beadwork in her room where she could see it daily, a testament to an unlikely friendship, forged in crisis and sustained by mutual respect. The captured warrior left to die in chains had been freed under moonlight by a rancher's daughter, who'd chosen conscience over safety, and both had been transformed by the encounter. In a time and place defined by conflict and division, they'd proven that individual choices could transcend historical enmities, that recognizing shared humanity required courage, but offered something invaluable in return. The knowledge that you'd acted according to your deepest values regardless of cost. Kate looked out over the Texas landscape she'd known all her life, seeing it now through eyes that recognized both its beauty and its complicated truths, and she felt grateful for the chains she'd broken, both the literal, ones that had bound Nako, and the invisible ones that had constrained her own understanding of what was possible when one person chose to act with courage and compassion in the face of injustice.